Hello everyone, welcome to another lecture in History 310 Online. This one, now following on the heels of our American Revolution lectures, is called From Revolution to Constitution, and it covers that critical period that followed the Revolutionary War and the writing of the American Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, in 1787. A period of only a few years, really, but extraordinarily significant in the history of this young nation. For the first time in historical memory, following the American Revolution, a nation had the opportunity to call itself into existence. The revolutionary Thomas Paine famously asked, "Can America be happy under a government of her own?" "As happy as she pleases," he answered. "She hath a blank sheet to write upon." And so it seemed this new nation was in a unique position historically to decide for itself what form of government would take and what sort of nation it would be. No nations, at least in historical memory, had had such an opportunity. Most nations were simply born of ages past and inherited through the generations. But this generation, this revolutionary generation, now had the singular opportunity to call this nation into existence. And what clues were there as to what type of nation it would be? Well, during the Revolution, the Congress had declared the new United States of America and wrote its first constitution, what we call the Articles of Confederation. In 1777, the Articles of Confederation were adopted as the revolution was just then underway, adopted as a firm league of friendship, as the document put it, a firm league of friendship among the states, that is, the former colonies. It was America's first constitution and created a new national government to symbolize, quote, perpetual union among the states. As Eric Foner suggests, it resembled a treaty for mutual defense more than a fully sovereign national government. Remember, this document was created during wartime, that is, the War for Independence. Its first article read, quote, each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. So that really suggested that the former colonies, now calling themselves United States, were united, but in a very specific way, mostly for mutual defense. Otherwise, each of them retained their own individual sovereignty. So no real concept yet of anything like a single nation. Now, after the Revolution, most assumed that the real governing would still be done locally, but the need to secure Western lands meant a national government would be necessary. And here you see a map showing the Western lands beyond the Appalachian Mountain Range, the Appalachian Range, which runs sort of diagonally from north to south, separating the states of the Atlantic seaboard here from the interior states of the Mississippi Valley, or I should say the interior territory of the Mississippi Valley, not yet organized at this point. Following the Treaty of Paris of 1783 that ended the Revolutionary War, the now independent states of America replaced the former colonies, as I say, and each of the 13, carried on its own constitution and government, like 13 separate countries might, while settling claims over the Western territories. And historians have argued that it was this process of settling the Western land claims which, to understand this, each of the colonies, that is, of the original 13 colonies, had originally charters written defining their boundaries, but because the North American continent was so poorly understood geographically, there wasn't any clear sense of where those western boundaries might end. So, for example, Virginia claimed territory up here in the Great Lakes, as did Massachusetts and Connecticut. And most of the other states claimed western territories as well. So one of the first points of business was for this new government under the Articles of Confederation to resolve those land claims and decide whether or when they would recede now to the new government. And it was probably one of the signal achievements of this new government under the Articles of Confederation that that process was resolved. As you can see here, the territories in the Mississippi Valley and the Great Lakes Basin region eventually all were ceded to the new United States government, giving that government immediate credibility and legitimacy, if for no other reason than it was to be the final arbiter of what happened with those western lands. At the same time, a precedent of popular sovereignty was established as the states carried out their own experiments in democracy and governing. Certain features among the states became common, politically speaking, that is. Most of them tended toward weak central authorities, so that, for example, governors tended not to have much executive power. Generally speaking, throughout the states, the property requirements for voting, that is, the qualifications for office holding and voting, were lowered to make it more democratic for at least free property owning males. Holding more frequent elections. The idea was that government needed to be responsive to the voters. The more elections, the more responsive government would be. Including rotation in offices, what we would call term limits these days, so that no one would become too ensconced in power and be tempted to rule corruptly. And finally, the publishing of legislative votes, often on a weekly basis, something we sometimes take for granted, but this was to be a hallmark of an American democracy. That is, that governing was not to be done in secret. And that what legislators did should be open to the critical scrutiny of the public, the voters. And so the legislative reports would be published weekly by each of the states. Here you see another map showing not only the states again, from Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south, but how new states, in fact, would be added in the early national period, including Kentucky and Tennessee in the 1790s. What was still called the Northwest Territory was not formally organized yet, nor was the Mississippi Territory. But otherwise, this new national government was able, along with the 13 separate state governments, to create a lot of resolution toward defining the political boundaries and the nature of these political experiments, these democratic experiments, you might say, among the various states. But the question remained, were the United States really united? You see a political cartoon of the day suggested perhaps not. The various state columns lined up, but here at the end, North Carolina and Rhode Island faltering. This was a jab at those two states who early in the period of the Articles of Confederation began to resist the tendencies toward united action. In other words, they struggled to speak with one voice, these united states. They struggled to speak with one voice, particularly regarding, say, foreign policy. The Spanish, knowing that the United States was too weak to fight for its territory militarily, banned American trading on the Mississippi River to discourage westward migration. Spain claimed the lands of the Mississippi and did not want Americans wandering in and becoming homesteaders or setting up trading posts and such. A very competitive business, this business of land claiming. While across the Atlantic, piracy off of the Barbary coast disrupted American overseas trade. The new American government lacked British protection now. Remember, there was no British Navy to protect American vessels, and the means to fight or bribe the pirates, the famous Barbary pirates here of the northern African coast, modern-day countries of Libya and Morocco and Algeria, for example, there was no longer a protective naval force to escort American vessels, and so American vessels were coming under constant attack by the coastal pirates the Barbary pirates. And there was little that the American government could do, even lacking the means to pay bribes to buy off or buy protection from the Barbary pirates. The national government simply didn't have the wherewithal, and individual states by themselves could not effectively deal with such a threat. So whether it was here in North America or overseas, the limitations of this new government were evident. And even independence and democracy seemed at times an awkward fit, as various financial issues proved difficult to settle. Consider a curious event known as the Newburgh Conspiracy, a dispute over Revolutionary War soldiers' pay. Revolutionary War soldiers were promised pay, of course, but many of them did not receive pay during the war, but were instead told that pay would be deferred until such time as the new governments could put together effective revenue measures and create a public treasury in order to pay the soldiers. Well, in some cases, this payment was delayed for years and years. In fact, it was that delay that inspired a plan known as the Newburgh Conspiracy for the town in New Jersey where it occurred. The Newburgh Conspiracy was a scheme, I guess you would call it, among Revolutionary War officers, veterans of the war, to threaten the Congress, the new National Congress, lest the soldiers, quote, grow old in poverty, wretchedness, and contempt. In other words, they wanted their money. They wanted to be paid. And so they hatched a plan to march on to Philadelphia, where the government, the national government at the time was located, to march on to Philadelphia, confront the Congress with force of arms, and basically exact payment, the payment that had been promised to the soldiers. Well, only George Washington's firm refusal to support the plan kept, quote, a convulsion of the most dreadful nature and fatal consequences. When Washington came upon his officers in meeting discussing these plans, he made it clear that he would have no part in such an affair, and it was the sheer force of his personality and his credibility as the great leader of the Americans during the Revolutionary War that basically cowed these men into abandoning their plans. So there would be no military march on Philadelphia, no forceful takeover of the Congress, no exacting of payment. It seems that civilian government would endure. That was the good news, I suppose. But the example left its mark. It seemed that it had been a close call, and there were more than a few who wondered if, in fact, this national government now really had any kind of hope of enduring. Consider other examples in these years. We're talking now about the 1780s. A simple plan to pay off America's debt also demonstrated the potential problem of, quote, too much democracy. Rhode Island, the smallest of the states in territory and population, Rhode Island used its veto power under the Articles of Confederation. Remember, it required all 13 states to unanimously agree to legislation for that legislation to take law. And Rhode Island used its veto privilege to deny a financial plan created in Congress to pay off the country's war debts. The so-called 5% plan would have levied an import tax on goods coming into the country. So it wasn't an internal tax, the sort of tax that caused so much ruckus and outcry during the run-up to the American Revolution. This 5% plan would have taxed foreign goods imported into the country, creating a levy that could be used then to establish a national treasury. Critics denounced Rogues Island, as they called those who made up the legislative contingent from the state of Rhode Island. Critics denounced Rogues Island, where judges were replaced by a popular assembly for daring to support creditors' claims to collect debts. In other words, any attempt to tax or even to collect debts legally enforceable, in this case by the judges of Rhode Island, were met with strict resistance by the citizens of that state, who resisted any and all attempts to either be taxed or even to have Revolutionary War debts now collected. In other words, they didn't want to pay up, and they used their legislature, Democratic legislature, to vote down all such efforts. In rebellion, a full-blown Massachusetts, or in Massachusetts, a full-blown rebellion will tip the scales. As Farmer Daniel Shays leads a mob of angry farmers against the judicial establishment in 1786, Massachusetts Governor Bowdoin dispatched an army and arrested over 1,000 of Shays' followers, claiming he saved the people of Massachusetts from a state of anarchy and confusion and slavery. Once again, the basic issue here was collection of debts. The western farmers of Massachusetts, having been indebted in the crazy commercial upheavals of the Revolutionary War era, many of them had served, in fact, as soldiers in the war, were resisting efforts now by creditors, mostly in Boston, to collect those debts, and calling for more time and more lenient terms of paying them off. And when they were refused by the judges of Massachusetts, in fact, instead threatened with confiscation of their lands, they organized under a leader, Daniel Shays, himself a Revolutionary War veteran, marched on the county courts in western Massachusetts and physically resisted, physically stopped the process of litigation and the collecting of farmers' debts, claiming that their revolutionary rights as free men, as natural-born men possessed of liberty, required another solution. And this so-called rebellion, which was essentially bloodless, there was a lot of saber rattling and sort of brandishing of weapons. These men were veterans of the war, after all. They still had weapons, muskets and others. So it created a real fear in the Eastern establishment, in Boston and beyond. When Governor Bowdoin called upon his fellow states to send militia soldiers to put down the Shayites, they all refused. None came to the aid of Massachusetts. Well, in the end, the Shayites were dispersed by militia regiments within Massachusetts. But the example seemed to serve notice once again that there would have to be a reconciliation between democracy and order, between individual rights and the ability of governments to function. Some even question whether liberty itself hadn't perhaps gone too far. And so the question becomes, had liberty lost its luster? Was there tyranny and democracy? Too much liberty? Liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty, as well as the abuses of power, according to James Madison of Virginia. Think about what Madison's saying here. He's saying that the greatest fear among the revolutionaries has been that their liberty was endangered by the centralizing authority of the English government, that is, by a tyrannical, centralized authority. But here Madison is saying that liberty could be endangered not only by the abuses of power, but also by the abuses of liberty. In a case like Rhode Island, where a legislature voted to prevent the collection of debts, for example, or even in Massachusetts, where a farmers' rebellion shut down the courts and prevented the collection of debts. All of this was done in the name of rights and liberty, but for Madison at least, it reflected a dangerous trend toward the undermining of government to do its very work. John Adams agreed. The Massachusetts lawyer and revolutionary wrote, "To expect self-denial from men when they have a majority in their favor, and consequently power to gratify themselves, is to disbelieve all history and universal experience." In other words, Adams is saying that a majority operating in the name of democracy could wreak as much havoc, particularly against the rights of the minority, as a centralized ruler, as a tyrant, as a King George could. As Thomas Jefferson put it, 173 despots would surely be as oppressive as one, referring there to the 173 members of the Rhode Island Assembly who voted en masse to prevent the collection of debts or the raising of revenue measures. 173 members of that Rhode Island Assembly, Jefferson saying, would be surely as oppressive as one. And finally, Madison, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. In other words, if people were truly capable of governing themselves without intermediaries, without the force of law, then government wouldn't be necessary. But men were not angels, in other words. Selfish interests, violent impulses, even a kind of collective hysteria, it seemed at times, could take hold of a democracy and run it dangerously toward something like tyranny. Influential men like Madison, Adams, Jefferson, now openly feared for domestic tranquility, that is the good order of society, calling for a convention in Philadelphia to meet in the late spring of 1787 to consider how the Articles of Confederation might be revised. Many of them felt that following the Newburgh conspiracy and the episodes in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, that perhaps the problem was that the Articles of Confederation, that is the national government created during the Revolutionary War, had moved too far away from centralized authority, that the national government was helpless to put down episodes like Shays' Rebellion, to raise revenues, to pay off debts, to meet even foreign crises, and that some stronger form of government with greater revenue measures, greater defense and military authority would be needed to protect the true interests of the revolutionary experiment. In other words, that left to their own devices, the 13 states would never rise to meet the challenges of a nation, and thus a stronger nation would have to be created. So that gets us up to the summer of '87 when the Constitutional Convention will meet. That'll form part 2 of our discussion now in the lecture From Revolution to Constitution.